Dostoevsky, the Russian novelist, wrote a famous novel called The Brothers Karamazov. In this novel, three brothers live together, of course, with a servant and the father. Ivan, the older brother, goes off to college. When he returns from college, he has a completely different worldview than the one with which he had left. And he makes the announcement that he has come to the point of atheism in his belief system. And along with that, he says, if God does not exist, everything is permitted, relishing in his newfound freedom to do whatever he wanted to do, to live his life in any way that he chose. The result of that pronouncement was that the servant took him very seriously. And the servant, who had always been embittered towards the father for being a harsh master, murdered Ivan's father. Ivan was obviously very distraught and very angry and just shocked beyond belief at what his servant had done. And the servant said, "You said it yourself, Ivan. If there is no God, then everything is permitted." Today we want to talk about this subject of morality, which I believe is one of the strongest arguments for the existence of God. C.S. Lewis, who was an atheist as well, came to be a theist and then a Christian on this very basis. He said that his atheism was due to his concept of the world being such an evil place, such an awful place. But the more he thought about it, the more he began to realize that he had no basis by which to call the world evil. He asked the question, how was I measuring evil unless there was an absolute good standard by which to judge it? And he gave several analogies in the way that Lewis always does to help us. He said, no man calls a line crooked unless he has some idea of a straight line. And if the entire world, the entire universe were dark and there were no creatures with eyes, then the concept of light and darkness would make no difference at all. Darkness would be an illusion. In the light of that illustration, today we want to consider the proposition that without God, if God does not exist, then morality does not exist. I'm a firm believer in that proposition, and I think I can make a strong case for theism in light of the fact that morality actually does exist, not in a relative way or in a cultural way. Well, certainly it exists in that way, but in an absolute way. Now, all atheists don't agree with that, of course. Kai Nielsen, the famous Canadian philosopher, says God or no God, some things are wrong, some things are right. I meet people all the time who claim to be atheists but proclaim their own goodness. At the top of that list would be Richard Dawkins, the famous atheistic biologist who's sort of leading the charge of the new militant atheism today, who consistently throughout his book, The God Delusion, proclaims himself to be a good person. Even just last night, we were speaking with an evolutionary psychologist who talked about his own morality and the existence of morality without God. The exception to that view is the famous philosopher Frederick Nietzsche, who is the first, as far as I know, to proclaim that God is dead. Now, you have to remember in historical context that Frederick Nietzsche came along in the 1800s. After Darwinism. He was actually born in 1800, but his philosophies became very prominent in the historical context of the evolutionary theory that we could explain man's existence without the necessity of a designer or a creator. And then along with that, the process called historical criticism, that because of the beliefs of the Enlightenment that man is the measure of all things and that we could determine every truth through the rational process, then subjected the Bible itself to that process, which is not innately wrong. The key word there would be subject, to where we take the Bible and put it under our scrutiny and judge it. And then philosophers would come along and say that since miracles are improbable, we need to demythologize the Bible. Well, the result of all that process was that the Bible became relatively meaningless. So in the light of evolutionary theory, which gave a scientific justification for atheism, and historical criticism, which gave an intellectual position from which to discount the Bible, Nietzsche comes along sort of as the undertaker and proclaims that now God is dead. But he realized the consequences of the non-existence of God regarding morality. Nietzsche made the statement that Once you take God out of the picture, morality is also dead. There is no basis for morality outside of God. And in his own inimitable way, in his character called the Madman, he proclaims that if God is dead, we've killed him. And he also predicted at the end of the 19th century that the 20th century would be the bloodiest in history. Indeed, most statisticians say that there were more people killed by violence in the 20th century than the 19 centuries preceding it combined. Now, it's also been said that per capita there are less people being killed now. But my answer to that simply would be that's almost a meaningless thing. It's just that there are so many more people that would be true. But nevertheless, the number of people killed by violence has increased in the 20th century to staggering proportions. Probably the greatest examples of that would be the two great atheistic experiments of the 20th century, German Nazism and Marxist Stalinism in Russia. Now, I don't mean to say by that all atheists are bad people or immoral people at all. I take their word for it that they're living relatively good lives, and certainly it's also true that many professing Christians don't live very moral lives. What I mean to say is that there is no basis for the morality that atheists claim to have. They may be moral, but their atheistic worldview gives them no foundation or any basis for that. On the other hand, Christianity provides a much better explanation for the existence of morality, the need for morality, and the accountability that has to go along with morality. So what we're going to do is look at the atheistic models that try to explain morality without God. The evolutionary model, the sociological model, and show that they fail utterly. And then we're going to look at the Christian view and show that it has both explanatory power and scope when it comes to moral terms. First, let's look at the atheistic, evolutionistic explanation for morality. Richard Dawkins has a chapter in his book, The God Delusion, entitled, Why Are We Good? And he explains morality in terms of evolution. Let me make a parenthetical point here. Someone who believes in evolution to the point of atheism, and there are many who do not, but someone who believes in evolution to that point, that everything it must be explained in terms of matter and energy, because that's all that exists. That means our brains are not minds, but they are functional machines. As a matter of fact, that's what many atheists and evolutionists call us. We're robotic, we're survival machines. So they have to then, if that's all there is, obviously everything has to be explained in those terms, including our sense of right and wrong. So how do they explain that? The idea that I feel guilt when I do something wrong, or I feel a sense of satisfaction or peace when I do something right. Well, they would explain it this way. The goal, and I hesitate to use that word, there are a lot of words you can't really use when you talk about evolution, because evolution has no goal. It just is what is. But we'll concede that term for the sake of conversation. The goal of evolution is survival. So everything that happens in our life, everything that we do is driven by this goal, if you will, of surviving. The second goal would be to promulgate. We have an instinct, according to evolution, to pass on our genes. And those two things are the only things that drive us, that move us. So the evolutionary explanation for morality is simply that altruistic genes, that is, whatever part of our genetic makeup that causes us to share, that causes us to be nice to our fellow man, that causes us to not take all we can get all the time from everybody we can, so to speak, that makes us civilized, you might say. Those genes are favored by natural selection. That means that if we are nice, if we share, the herd, our societies survive better, and hence so do we. So they call that reciprocation. Basically, it just means that I'll scratch your back if you'll scratch mine. And so that's their explanation of morality. Now, on that basis, what I want to show you is that they're not describing or prescribing what we should do. They're only describing what we actually do. So it's very important to understand that. Christian morality is very different from that. It's prescriptive. I think all morality, by definition, has to be prescriptive. The difference is, if you view this idea of morality on evolutionary terms, you have to leave out words like ought. You don't say, this is what you ought to do, though we use those terms a lot. But on the evolutionary view, you can't really use that term rationally. It's only descriptive. This is what you, in fact, do because you have this innate drive to survive and to promulgate your species. So it's not a matter of whether you should or should not do that. If that be the case, then in some way evolution, you would think, might say to a couple, let's say, that decides not to have children, that on an evolutionary basis they're doing the wrong thing. But they can't say that. They can only describe what is being done. Now, my point will be that even on that basis, it's a very weak explanation because, number one, most people don't do what they think they should do. So it's to be true, to be real, to be other than an illusion, morality has to be prescriptive. So on evolutionary terms then, we have to understand that everything is matter and energy. That means nothing immaterial exists. That means that the mind is actually an illusion. There's not a mind, only the brain. That means the soul, the concept of our soul, is an illusion. It's only something that we imagine to be. My point is that that's the same thing holds true for morality. Actual morality, the sense of right and wrong, is still an illusion because everything, we are survival machines. Richard Dawkins has said that we're driven by our DNA, sometimes to be altruistic for the purpose of survival and passing on our genes. But we call that right and wrong, but that's only an illusion. He has said our DNA doesn't know, neither does our DNA care. So the issue of real responsibility, which is tied to morality, is out the window. It makes no difference at all. So it's important that we understand basically two things about the evolutionary model, the evolutionary explanation for morality. First of all, it's not actually describing morality. As such, it's only telling us what we call morality, which is really an illusion, is only a function of survival and the promulgation of our genetic code. The point is here, you can't use words like you should do this. Should doesn't enter into the picture because there's no design. If I say this is what you ought to do or this is what you ought not to do, it implies that there's some purpose or design, there's some target. As a matter of fact, this might be a good time to bring up the point that the very word for sin in the scriptures is the word missing the target. That's what sin is. Romans 3:23 says, all have sinned and come short of the glory of God. Thereby giving us a biblical philosophy, a biblical worldview that there is a moral target out there. Now, evolution, it's interesting to me in both the case of intelligent design and morality basically say the same thing. Evolution would say that design appears to be everywhere. They agree with that, but they say it is an illusion of design. It's not real design. They would say the same thing about morality. What we think is right and wrong, what we think is guilt, what we think is morality is really an illusion. It's all about survival and it's only descriptive. Now, let me ask a first question here. Dawkins' chapter title is, Why Are We Good? Well, I think there are two problems even with that chapter title. The first problem is, why is there, the chapter title is why are we good, but the chapter title should be, why is there a good? Why is there some goal of goodness out there? Why do we need to be good? The second problem is the chapter title really should be, why are we not good? And if evolution can explain that, if evolution can explain how we came to be good, how does it explain how we came to be not good? And certainly that everyone would agree that no matter what moral standard you choose, nobody would say they're perfect. There's a third problem with that, which we'll get into in just a minute. It's the problem of the whole idea of relativism, because any view of morality that leaves out God as a lawgiver must rely on relative morality, not an absolute, but a relative morality. I'm going to show that's self-destructive. The prevailing worldview today is relativism. It's the postmodern philosophy, and the basis of that is simply that all truth is relative, which seems to me another way of saying there is no actual truth. There is no actual reality. We make our own reality. We make our own truth. That whole idea takes me back really to the Garden of Eden. The biblical account says that when the tempter, Satan, came to Adam and Eve, his temptation to them was, wouldn't you like to be like God? Wouldn't you like to be equal with God? Well, they were interested in that, in particular Eve at first. Well, his way, his path to becoming like God was for her to take on the responsibility of knowing good from evil. That is to say, she could decide for herself what's right and what's wrong. This is a very basic and very large issue, because if God decides morality, then He's God. If we decide morality, then we are God. And if evolution produces some sort of elusive morality, then there is none. So those are really the three only logical choices that I can see. A good illustration of the problem of relativism took place after World War II, especially in regards to morality. 23 or 24 Nazi war criminals were being tried in Nuremberg at one of the first truly international courts for their war crimes against humanity, they call them, which brings up another concept. But the defense attorney, the guy defending those war criminals' case was based on the idea that they broke no laws and hence could not be prosecuted. And he had a point, because virtually everything that was done against humanity was done under the auspices of the laws that the German legislature had actually passed during the Nazi regime. So on what basis then could they be tried? If truth is relative, then certainly morality has to be relative. And what's it relative to? To what is morality relative? Well, it would have to be relative either to the individual or to the particular culture in mind. So if the German culture, the German society at that point decided that genocide was the right thing to do, Hitler believed he was actually helping evolution along. He was a great fan of Frederick Nietzsche, so was Stalin, so was Mussolini. Those three, Paul Jones, the great historian, calls the three devils of the 20th century. At any rate, the prosecuting attorney was Robert Jackson. He at the time was a United States Supreme Court justice appointed by Harry Truman, then President of the United States, to prosecute these war criminals. Well, his prosecution was based on an entirely different philosophy, the philosophy of moral absolutism. The idea that there are higher laws that supersede any cultural or any individual laws. Laws like that give us human rights. Now both the Declaration of Independence and even the United Nations Charter now appeal to the fact that all people have human rights. They view that as an inherent, absolute law. And of course on that basis those Nazi war criminals were prosecuted. But on a relative basis they could not be. There are so many problems with relativism, the biggest one being that it is actually self-destructive at its very core. When a person says to me, all truth is relative, he's self-defeating, because he's making an absolute statement. The very statement, all truth is relative, is an absolute statement about truth itself. And so he's defeating himself and simply making the statement. Finally, what I'd like to show is that in actuality, everybody believes in an absolute morality. Theirs. If you want to trouble someone or discourse with someone who says all truth is relative, what they really mean is they don't want you imposing your morality on them. But try attacking their morality. A lot of the time when I'm talking to someone who proclaims atheism or proclaims that morality is evolutionary, I ask them this question: In your opinion, what's wrong with the world? I've never had anyone say nothing, which is the only logical explanation from an atheistic viewpoint. Since there is no target, since there is no goal, how can we say we've missed it? And when we say something's wrong with the world, the implication is that we've missed some absolute target that has been put out there. Well, the next question obviously is who put it there? Kai Nielsen, again, the famous Canadian philosopher, says, God or no God, now listen to this, he says, not God or no God, wife beating and child molestation is wrong. Well, the obvious question then is why? It's certainly not wrong in a lot of cultures. In some very strict cultures, they actually mutilate their women so that they can't have any sexual arousement, and thereby all they are is breeding machines for the men. And they see no problem with that. They don't see that as wrong. There was a time in American society when slavery was considered right, and of course that's true all throughout history. It's only been recently that human rights were elevated to the point that slavery was condemned. So if Kai Nielsen can say that no matter if there's a God or not, wife beating and child molestation are wrong, on what basis can he make that statement? Is he the one that is the absolute moral lawgiver? Obviously not. He would not say that. But if his statement is true, that those things are actually wrong, and I certainly agree with him, there has to be a lawgiver, there has to be a target that has been put out there that goes beyond the individual, beyond the culture, and beyond even the human race. C.S. Lewis calls it that third voice, the voice of God speaking to us in our own conscience. Having shown, I think, pretty conclusively, at least in my view, that the evolutionary model for morality fails utterly, so does the cultural view, that one culture determines what's moral. In that case, you can't have any moral progress because you have no basis by which to measure one culture against another. You know, I mentioned earlier that the Declaration of Independence and the United Nations say that humans have rights. Well, the biblical model is simply that they actually do have rights because they are a special creation of an eternal God who has a plan for us, a design for us, a reason for our existence, and that's very important, as we'll see at the end. But we have fallen in our nature, in our rebellion against God, in our desire to choose for ourselves what's right and wrong. We have fallen. Our nature has fallen. And so that's what makes us selfish, not an evolutionary process. And that's why we don't do what we even believe we ought to do. Evolution can't really explain that. So the study of Christian goodness then goes way beyond what evolutionary altruism demands. For example, Jesus said, love your enemies. That's Christian goodness. That's Christian morality. But there's no evolutionary reason to do that. There's no reciprocation. If I love my enemy, there's certainly no guarantee that he's going to love me back or that it's going to help my survival at all. Love, in the Christian view, is the measure of all morality. Think about that. Jesus said that all of the commandments can be summed up into two. Now, think about this. All morality can be summed up into two commandments in the Christian view. What are those commandments? The first is that we love God, our Creator, with all of our heart, our soul, and our mind. And the second, he said, is like unto it, that we love each other in the same way that God loves us. Well, that gives us so many things. Within that context, we find purpose, we find meaning, we find significance, we have human rights, we have responsibilities, which is the basis for morality. It's what gives our lives significance. I want to read you, in conclusion here, a quote from playwright Arthur Miller in his play After the Fall. His main character is a man named Quentin. I want you to listen to this carefully. I think it's beautiful. For many years, Quentin says, I looked at life like a case at law. It was a series of proofs. When you're young, you prove how brave you are or how smart, then what a good lover, then a good father, finally, how wise or powerful or whatever. But underlying it all, I see now there was a presumption that one moved on an upward path towards some elevation where God knows what, I would be justified or even condemned. That's the target, by the way. A verdict, anyway. I think now that my disaster really began when I looked up one day and the bench was empty. No judge in sight. And all that remained was the endless argument with oneself, this pointless litigation of existence before an empty bench, which of course is another way of saying despair. Morality is the basis for our significance, and God is the basis for our morality, and God is love. That's where we get meaning for life. I hope you'll consider these things. Thanks for watching. Church for Skeptics began in January of 2003. As far as I know, it's the only program that focuses on giving reasonable answers for skeptical people regarding the Christian faith that's on a non-religious network. If this program is helping you better understand the claims of Jesus Christ, please consider helping us continue this work by sending a tax-deductible contribution. You can send a check made out to Educare to the following address with Church for Skeptics on the memo line. Thanks very much for your consideration.